Mr. Thomas was a skilled tailor known for his intricate and beautiful clothing designs. He serviced some of the wealthiest patrons in the metropolitan area and made a very good living for himself. He had been in business for over 20 years, inheriting the business from his father. He had great pride in his family and his reputation, and was well received by the locals. It all began with a faint whisper that Mr. Thomas heard while working late in his shop. "Thomas, your hands are cursed," it said. He looked around, but the shop was empty. He tried to ignore it, but the voice persisted. Again and again he would hear the whispers, sometimes after 30 minutes or an hour of no whispers at all. Just enough for Mr. Thomas to wonder if he was really hearing anything at all. Mr. Thomas began to feel a cold presence in his shop, especially between the time the last client left for the day and the time he closed his shop. More specifically, near his work table where he spent much of his time. The whispers continued, suggesting that his craft was somehow tainted. "You will ruin them all," they taunted with a menacing tone. This made him very uneasy. Mr. Thomas spent hours trying to perfect every stitch. He started seeing ghostly figures in his shop, their faces grimacing. The whispers grew louder, haunting him more regularly as he tried to make it through his day. Years ago, Mr. Thomas had made a dress for a young girl who later died tragically in a bad accident. A drunk driver ran a stop sign, and though the mother survived, there was no hope for the young girl. He had been delayed that day after having taken a longer than normal lunch break, leaving the mother and her daughter waiting for him to return. He could not shake the thought that his timely return from lunch would have enabled them to be in a different place from the scene of the accident that day. If only he had not tarried. The memory of that incident had always haunted him, but now it seemed to blend with his current fears, making him question his abilities and his sanity. Desperate, Mr. Thomas confided in his friends and even talked to a counsellor, but no one believed him. They suggested he was just under stress and needed a break. After all, he was generally there from open to close most days of the week, and his son only came in for a few hours during the week after school to help around the shop. His family worried about his state of mind, urging him to take some time off, but he refused. He had to maintain his timely service. His reputation was all he had. The whispers became more insistent. "You cannot escape your guilt, Mr. Thomas. You tarried. You are responsible for her death," they cried. Mr. Thomas started seeing the ghostly figures more frequently, their eyes tracking him around the shop as he worked. He could feel their gaze on him. The cold presence became unbearable, chilling him to the bone. He became paranoid and short-tempered, even with customers. He would apologize immediately and divert his eyes out of embarrassment. This just wasn't him. Something had to change. The ghostly figures continued to haunt him from the shadows. He couldn't tell what was real and what was a figment of his tortured mind. He started doubting his sanity, wondering if he was truly losing his grip. One night, as he was alone in his shop, the whispers became a roar. "You will soon join us, Thomas. You will soon cross over for your misdeeds, for your negligence," they demanded. He saw the ghost of the young girl in the dress he had made, her face twisted in pain and sorrow. Mr. Thomas screamed in horror. He had children of his own, and just the thought of losing them was too much to bear. Mr. Thomas ran out of the shop, desperate to escape the voices and the ghosts. He tore out of the parking lot in a flash, tears streaming down his face. He locked himself in his house and fell to his knees, begging for it to stop. Just as he was about to give in to despair, his house filled with a blinding light. The whispers turned into a furious hiss. "You cannot escape us!" they roared. But then Mr. Thomas felt a warm presence suddenly envelop him, pushing the darkness away. He looked up, disoriented, only to see the spirit of his late father. He said nothing, but his very presence was enough to let him feel like everything was going to be okay. He had a long and pleading gaze as his father gave him a reassuring nod before fading out of sight. Mr. Thomas suddenly remembered his plight and whipped around to see where the ghosts had gone, but there were none to be found. All had fallen silent. All was calm. He sat, still on his knees on the floor, sobbing. He had endured so much the past few weeks. The pressure, the nightmares, the voice, the face of that little girl. The next morning Mr. Thomas woke up to a bright new day. He felt lighter. His guilt had melted away. He had faced his fears and he had overcome them. Everything was going to be all right. And yet there was still something evil lurking in the shadows, something that fed on the fear and suffering of the innocent. But Mr. Thomas was immune to its toxicity. He had braved the fire and he had come out whole on the other side. And you, my friend, have you ever heard whispers in the silence of a dark and empty room? Have you ever felt a cold presence, one that chills you to the bone? Well, now you know you're not alone, but you can fight the darkness. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and follow us for more. Join us on TikTok and YouTube for more Chilling Chronicles, if you dare.